This is my house! Get out before I call the police on you!
Call them, then call your son and ask him whose name is really on that deed.
They threw my life into the street, left every memory at my feet.
Phoebe's mother-in-law changed the locks while she was at work. By the time Phoebe got home, her clothes were already on the front lawn, stuffed into black trash bags like garbage waiting for pickup. Neighbors stood on their porches watching, and there, in the middle of it all, stood the woman who had just called her a gold digger in front of her own daughter, the woman who told the whole street that Phoebe would never set foot in her house again. What that woman didn't know was simple, and it would change everything. The deed to that house didn't have her name on it. It had her son's, and he was 7 minutes away from finding out exactly what his mother had just done. This is the story of Phoebe, a black nurse who married into a Korean-American family, and the single afternoon that cracked open every secret that house had been built on. Stay until the end. What happened on that lawn was only the beginning. Phoebe married into the Choi family 6 years earlier, and from the start, her husband Daniel had a way of noticing things other men didn't. He remembered how she liked her coffee black, how she went quiet instead of loud when she was overwhelmed, how she needed 5 minutes of silence after a 12-hour shift before she could talk about her day. Daniel was a second-generation Korean-American, born and raised outside Atlanta, working as a site engineer on commercial builds across the state. They had met at the hospital where Phoebe worked as a nurse after he came in with a fractured wrist from a job site accident. He never quite left her life after the cast came off. She remembered that first meeting clearly, even years later. He had been embarrassed about the injury, joking that a grown man shouldn't be brought down by a loose scaffold plank, and she had laughed despite herself while setting his splint. There was something disarming about a man who could laugh at his own pain instead of performing toughness. By the time the cast came off 6 weeks later, he had found 3 separate reasons to return to that hospital wing, and by the time they married 2 years after that, Phoebe had stopped keeping track of the ways he'd quietly rearranged his life to make room for hers. When Daniel's father's health began failing, he moved his young family into the house his mother had lived in for over 15 years, in a quiet Korean-American enclave outside the city. Everyone in the family called her Amma. To Phoebe, she was simply her mother-in-law. And from the very first week, Amma made sure Phoebe understood exactly where she stood. Amma had buried her husband years earlier, and in the time since, she had built her entire sense of self around one thing, this house. It was where she'd raised Daniel and his sister. It was where she had survived widowhood, hosted every holiday, every church gathering, every quiet grief she never spoke about out loud. To her, the walls of that house weren't brick and drywall. They were proof that she hadn't been erased the day her husband died. Phoebe understood that, even in the beginning. She tried to understand it. She told herself that grief made people brittle, that a woman who had lost her husband and watched her children scatter into their own lives might cling too tightly to the one thing that hadn't left her. She told herself this on the nights Amma's comments cut deepest, repeating it like a prayer meant to keep her own resentment from calcifying into something uglier. But understanding a woman's pain doesn't stop her from using it as a weapon. It started small, the way it always does. Amma called her the American girl instead of using her name, even at the dinner table in front of guests. She threw out food Phoebe cooked, claiming it didn't belong in this kitchen, when really she just didn't want Phoebe's hands anywhere near her space. Once, Phoebe had spent an entire Saturday afternoon teaching herself to make japchae from a recipe Daniel's sister had sent her, standing over the stove for 3 hours trying to get the noodles exactly right, only to come home from a hospital shift the next day and find the entire pot gone. In its place was a note in Amma's handwriting that read simply, "Not our taste." When Phoebe gave birth to a daughter, a bright, curious girl they named Hannah, Amma didn't hide her disappointment that the baby wasn't a boy. "Some wives just don't carry what a family needs," she told her sister on the phone, her voice pitched loud enough to travel down the hallway, as if fertility was a character flaw instead of biology. Phoebe had been recovering from a difficult delivery in the next room when she heard those words, Hannah asleep against her chest. She pressed her lips to her daughter's soft head and whispered, "You are exactly what this family needed, if only to drown out the other voice in the house." Phoebe worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, sometimes doubles when the floor was short-staffed, driven partly by the extra pay and partly, if she was honest with herself, by the relief of being somewhere Umma's voice couldn't reach her. But to Umma, her absence wasn't sacrifice, it was evidence. "She's never home," Umma would mutter to anyone who'd listen. "I don't know what kind of wife spends more time with strangers than her own family." Daniel loved his mother, and Phoebe never wanted to become the wedge between them. So when she brought these moments to him gently, without accusation, choosing her words with the same care she used when delivering hard news to a patient's family, he responded the same way every time. "She's just set in her ways, Phoebe. Give her time. You two will figure it out." He believed that because he needed to believe it. Admitting that his mother was capable of real cruelty toward the black woman he loved was harder for him to hold than Phoebe's discomfort was. Phoebe understood this too, in the quiet, exhausted way a person understands something that will keep hurting them regardless. Daniel was not a cruel man. He was a man who had spent his whole life being the peacekeeper between two women he loved, and peacekeeping, she had learned, often looked like looking away. There was one thing buried underneath all of it that mattered more than anyone realized yet. 2 years before the day Phoebe's clothes ended up on that lawn, Daniel did something he never told his mother about. After his father's estate dragged through a bitter dispute, an uncle trying to claim a share of the property, lawyers circling, months of stress that had aged Daniel 5 years and 8 months, Daniel used his savings, his overtime pay from job sites, and a bank loan to buy the house outright from the estate and put the title in his own name. He hadn't done it to take anything from his mother, he'd done it to protect her. If the house stayed tangled in probate court, any relative could reopen a claim on it for years to come. By recording the new deed in his own name, he closed that door for good. He kept quietly paying the property taxes. He let his mother go on believing, in her heart and in her daily life, that the house was still hers, because he saw no harm in that belief, and he didn't want the confrontation that came with correcting it. He'd shown Phoebe the documents only once, folded into an envelope in the bottom drawer of their bedroom dresser, on a night that Hannah was still an infant and the house was finally quiet. "Just in case anything ever happens to me, you'll need to know where these are." Phoebe remembered thinking at the time how strange it was to keep something so significant hidden from the woman living under that very roof. Why don't you just tell her? Let her rest easy knowing the house is permanently safe. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, a habit she recognized as his tell for discomfort, and sighed. "Because if I tell her, she'll ask why I didn't trust her enough to include her in the paperwork, and the honest answer is that Uncle Sam almost turned this into a decade-long fight, and I couldn't risk her saying something in anger that gave him an opening. It was easier to just handle it and let her keep believing what already made her feel safe." Phoebe hadn't pushed further. She slid the envelope back into the drawer and let the thought go, filing it away the way she filed away most of the friction in that house, not resolved, just postponed, until the day she needed it. Daniel was assigned to a job site 4 hours away in Savannah, a 6-week contract that would take him out of the house entirely, overseeing structural work on a new medical office building. The night before he left, he held Phoebe's hand across the dinner table, his thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles, the way it did when he was trying to reassure himself as much as her. "Just hold the fort. I'll call every night." Phoebe didn't tell him she was afraid. She didn't want to be the wife who couldn't survive 6 weeks without her husband running interference between her and his mother. She told herself she could handle it. She had survived worse shifts, worse losses, worse nights in that hospital than anything a house could throw at her. Surely 6 weeks under one roof with a difficult woman was manageable. She was wrong. The first week, Uma began locking the kitchen after her evening cooking, leaving Phoebe to prepare meals for herself and Hannah on a small hot plate in the bedroom, like a guest confined to a single room in her own home. When Phoebe asked why, Uma said the kitchen needed rest in the evenings, an answer that made no real sense because it wasn't meant to. It was meant to remind her of her place. Phoebe stood in that doorway for a long moment, hot plate cord dangling from her hand, and felt something in her chest tighten that she didn't yet have a name for. The second week, Uma invited a woman from her church circle over for tea. In front of Phoebe, in front of 4-year-old Hannah, she told the woman she hoped Daniel would one day find a proper Korean wife who understands family duty. The woman, to her credit, looked uncomfortable, glancing at Phoebe with something like apology in her eyes, but she said nothing to stop it. Phoebe sat there, holding her daughter's hand, while a stranger discussed replacing her as though she were furniture due for reupholstering, and she smiled the whole time, because smiling was the only defense she had left in that room. That night, Phoebe called Daniel, her voice shaking as she described what happened. He went quiet for a long moment before answering, and she could hear the exhaustion of his own long day layered underneath his words. "I'll talk to her when I get back. Please, Phoebe. 6 more weeks. I hate that I'm not there to protect you. Just hold on." "I'm not asking you to protect me, Daniel. I'm asking you to believe me." "I do believe you." And she wanted so badly to hear the truth in it that she let herself believe him too. She held on. The third incident was the one that broke everything open. In the pantry sat a small box where Uma kept an envelope of housekeeping cash, contributions from Daniel, from his sister, money meant for groceries and utilities while he was away. One morning, Uma walked into Phoebe's room while she was dressing for a hospital shift and accused her, flatly and without warning, of stealing from that envelope. $200. It was there Sunday. It is not there now. Only you and I have been in this house. I haven't touched it. I've never even opened that box. You people always find a way. You come into a family with nothing, and you leave with everything. Phoebe carried that sentence with her all day, a stone lodged in her chest through a full 12-hour shift. She thought about it while starting an IV line, while comforting a frightened patient's family, while eating a rushed lunch alone in the break room because she couldn't bear the thought of small talk. She drove home exhausted, the kind of exhausted that lives in the bones, and pulled into the driveway to find her clothes stacked on the front lawn in black bin bags, like trash set out for collection. Neighbors stood on their porches, some pretending not to watch, others not bothering to pretend at all, and in the middle of it all was Uma, arms crossed, holding Hannah's hand. Hannah was crying. Not loudly, but with the confused, quiet tears of a small child who senses something is wrong without understanding what. "Mommy, why is Grandma putting your clothes outside?" Before Phoebe could answer, Hannah tugged at her sleeve and in a small, shaky voice tried to defend her, telling her grandmother that Mommy lived there too, that she was her mom and shouldn't be treated like a visitor. Phoebe didn't answer right away. Her hands were trembling, but she kept them still at her sides through sheer will. She looked at Uma instead. "This is my house. You were only ever a visitor here, a guest who overstayed. Take your things and go back to wherever you came from." Later, Phoebe would say she expected to scream, to break down right there on the lawn in front of everyone, to let 6 years of small indignities pour out of her all at once. Instead, something in her went very still. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the shift. Maybe it was 6 weeks of small cruelties finally reaching their ceiling. Whatever it was, her voice came out quiet and even, steadier than she felt. "You're right that I don't own this house, but you should call your son before you say another word. Call him. Let him hear how you've turned his own mother against him." Phoebe picked up her daughter, feeling the small body trembling against her own, and promised her everything would be fine, even though she had no idea yet whether that was true. She drove them both to Grace's apartment across town, Hannah asleep against the car seat within 10 minutes, worn out from crying. Phoebe called Daniel from the car, hands steady now, on the wheel out of pure necessity. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She didn't know it yet, but he was already at the airport. He'd decided, without telling her, to fly home early and surprise them for the weekend, missing her calls by minutes, his phone buried in his carry-on as he boarded. That night, after Hannah finally fell asleep in Grace's guest room, curled around a stuffed rabbit Grace kept for these exact occasions, Phoebe sat at the kitchen table and thought about the envelope in the bottom drawer of their bedroom dresser. She thought about the papers folded inside it, about the strange, small comfort Daniel had offered her years earlier without either of them realizing how much weight that comfort would eventually carry. Phoebe, for the first time since Daniel had shown them to her 2 years earlier, understood exactly why he'd asked her to remember where they were. Grace poured her a glass of wine she barely touched and sat across from her in silence for a long while before finally asking a simple question. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to wait. For once, I'm not going to be the one who fixes this." Daniel landed that evening, expecting to surprise his wife and daughter with an early homecoming, a small bouquet of grocery store flowers still in his hand from the airport gift shop. Instead, he walked into a house with an empty side of the closet, a daughter who wasn't there, and a mother waiting for him with a strange, satisfied calm, as though she'd been rehearsing this moment. "Daniel, where's Phoebe? Where's Hannah?" He dropped his bag in the hallway, the flowers still in his hand, suddenly absurd in the tension of the room. Uma told him what she'd done, and in her mind, she told it as a victory: the missing money, the American girl's ingratitude, and the order she'd finally restored to her own house. She recounted it almost proudly, expecting her son to nod along the way he always had, to sigh and say she was set in her ways and everyone would sort it out eventually. He didn't. Daniel stood very still in the doorway, the same stillness Phoebe had felt on that lawn hours earlier. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet Uma had never heard from him before. Quiet, coming from someone who never raised his voice, is far more frightening than shouting. Daniel set the flowers down on the hallway table, slowly, deliberately, as if giving himself time to keep his composure. "Whose name is on the deed of this house, Uma?" She blinked, confused by the question, thrown by its specificity. "Mine. It has always been mine. Your father built this for me." "No, it hasn't been in your name for 2 years. He walked past her into the bedroom, his footsteps too calm for the storm building behind his eyes, and opened the bottom drawer of the dresser. He pulled out the envelope Phoebe had once seen but never opened, carried it back to the dining table, and laid the documents across it, one by one, in front of his mother. The county property record, the bank payoff letter showing the loan fully settled, the recorded deed dated 2 years earlier bearing his name and his name alone. After Dad died and Uncle Sam tried to claim a share through probate, I bought this house outright. I paid off the loan myself. I did it so no one could ever take it from you in court. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel like your home was slipping out of your hands. I thought I was protecting you." Uma stared at the papers as if they were written in a language she didn't recognize, her hand hovering above the deed without quite touching it, as though touching it would make it more real. "You lied to me. I kept something from you to protect your peace. You lied about my wife to protect your pride. Those aren't the same thing, Uma." She sat down slowly at the table, the fight draining out of her all at once, her hands folded in her lap like a woman waiting for a verdict she already suspected. "I didn't know. I didn't know it wasn't mine anymore." "That's exactly the point. You didn't know, and instead of asking me, instead of trusting that I would tell you if something changed, you decided the safest thing to do was punish the person you thought had the least power in this house. You decided Phoebe was the threat, when the only thing that ever threatened this family was silence, yours and mine both. A particular kind of silence falls over a room when someone realizes the ground they've stood on for years was never actually theirs. It stretched between them for a long, uncomfortable minute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Then came the second blow. 2 days later, while cleaning behind Uma's dresser, an old habit of tidying that Daniel's sister still kept out of respect whenever she visited, the missing envelope of housekeeping cash turned up, tucked behind a stack of folded linens exactly where Uma had hidden it herself months earlier for safekeeping and simply forgotten in the fog of her own grief and stress. There had been no theft. There never was. The accusation that ended with Phoebe's clothes and trash bags on the front lawn had been built on a mistake Uma made and blamed on someone else because admitting she'd misplaced the money herself was harder than pointing a finger at a woman she'd already decided didn't belong. Uma's sister called him the moment she found it, her voice careful, unwilling to pile on to a situation already balanced on a knife's edge. It was never her. It was never Phoebe. Daniel sat with that confirmation for a long time before he said anything to his mother at all. Daniel didn't shout at his mother. He didn't need to. Instead, he laid out a choice as plainly as the documents had lain on the table days earlier, his voice level, his eyes not moving from hers. "You can go to Phoebe, in front of the same neighbors who watched you humiliate her, and make this right. Or you can keep living in this house as though nothing happened, and I'll have to think seriously about whether my wife and daughter are safe here at all. I won't choose between you and my family, Uma, but I will choose their peace over your comfort, every time from now on." Uma didn't answer right away. She looked, for the first time in longer than Daniel could remember, genuinely afraid, not of losing the house, but of losing her son and granddaughter entirely. Daniel told Phoebe later that his mother hadn't slept that night. She sat alone in the dark living room long after he'd gone to bed, and for the first time in years, she let herself remember why she'd gripped this house so tightly in the first place. She had been in her 30s when her husband died, left with 2 children and a circle of relatives who whispered about whether she deserved to keep living in her son's house as a widow. She had watched other widows in her church community lose their homes to greedy relatives within a year of burying their husbands. Standing at her husband's funeral, gripping a handful of dirt she was meant to scatter over his casket, she had promised herself that no one would ever again make her feel like a guest in her own life. Somewhere along the way, protecting that promise had curdled into a fear so large it swallowed her ability to see her daughter-in-law as anything but a threat, and made it easy to layer that fear with prejudice she had never once examined about a black woman marrying into her family. She had never called it prejudice, even in the privacy of her own mind. She had called it protecting the family. It took sitting alone in that dark living room, replaying her son's quiet, devastating question, for her to finally call it what it was. 2 days later, Uma showed up at Grace's apartment without calling ahead, still wearing the same cardigan she'd had on the day she put Phoebe's clothes on the lawn. When Grace opened the door, Uma asked quietly, almost too quietly to hear, if she could speak to Phoebe. Phoebe almost said no, and she wouldn't apologize for that instinct. 6 weeks of small cruelties and one enormous public humiliation don't dissolve just because a woman shows up at your door looking smaller than you remember her. But Hannah was there, tugging at her sleeve. "Mommy, is that Grandma? Can she come in?" Something in her daughter's small voice, hopeful, uncomplicated, still capable of loving without condition, made Phoebe open the door. Uma didn't perform an apology. She didn't cry for effect or list excuses. She sat across from Phoebe at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and spoke. "I was afraid of becoming nobody in my own home. I let that fear turn into cruelty, and I let old prejudice I never questioned shape how I treated you. I was wrong about the money, I was wrong about you, and I said things in front of my granddaughter that I will carry shame for a long time." Then she turned to Hannah, her voice softening in a way Phoebe had rarely heard from her. "Your mother is not a visitor in this family. She is my son's wife, and she is your mother, and she is someone I should have honored a long time ago. I'm sorry it took so long for me to say that." Hannah frowned in a way only a 4-year-old can, hugging herself and telling her grandmother she didn't want her to be mean to Mommy again. It was simple, childlike, but it landed harder than any adult speech in the room. Phoebe didn't forgive her fully in that moment, and that was all right. Forgiveness that arrives too fast after real harm usually isn't real. It's performance, a way of smoothing over discomfort rather than actually healing it. She told Uma she appreciated what she said, and she told her exactly what she needed going forward. We need family counseling, all of us, with someone neutral, and we need a written household agreement about respect, about boundaries, about what will and won't be tolerated in this house. Not punishment, structure, the kind that should have existed years ago. Uma agreed, without arguing, her eyes wet but her voice steady. 3 months passed. Nothing became perfect, that wouldn't be honest to say, but something real did shift in that house outside Atlanta. Uma started attending a widow's support group at a nearby church that Phoebe had mentioned to her months earlier that she'd waved off at the time. The first session, she sat in the back and said almost nothing. By the 4th session, she was the one staying late to help another widow figure out paperwork for a pension claim, something in the act of helping another woman navigate what she herself had once navigated alone, seeming to loosen something in her chest that had been tight for 15 years. She began watching Hannah in the afternoons without the old undertone of resentment, teaching her songs from her own childhood instead of quiet criticisms about her mother. Hannah repeated unfamiliar words happily, slowly picking up phrases from a language that connected her to her grandmother's past. Uma even started asking Phoebe questions about her nursing recertification, small questions first, careful and a little awkward, then real ones, the way people ask when they finally started to see someone instead of a category. The family counseling sessions were not easy. There were sessions where Uma grew defensive, where old habits of deflection surfaced, and the counselor had to gently redirect the conversation back to accountability. There were sessions where Phoebe cried for the first time since the day on the lawn, finally allowing herself to grieve 6 years of small erosions she'd swallowed in the name of keeping peace. But slowly, session by session, something like an actual relationship began to take the place of the careful, guarded distance that had defined the house for so long. The biggest change came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, 3 months after the day Phoebe's clothes had sat in bin bags on that lawn. Daniel gathered the family in the living room with a folder of new paperwork. I'm putting the house into a family trust, not to punish anyone, not because I don't trust you, because I never want ownership to become a weapon again. Both his name and Phoebe's name would be listed as trustees, their names side by side on a document that would outlast any of them. It was Uma who suggested adding a clause. Make sure this house is always a home for anyone in the family who needs shelter, a widow, a relative who's struggling, anyone. Let it be useful instead of a weapon. Phoebe still thinks about that lawn sometimes. The bin bags, the neighbors watching, her daughter's confused tears. It was the lowest moment of her marriage, and also, somehow, the beginning of the only real peace this family has ever known. A house built on silence will always crack under pressure eventually. If you've ever had to fight for your place in your own home, tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe because more stories like Phoebe's are coming. Stories about family, about the truths we hide to protect the people we love, and what happens when those truths finally come out into the light.
Into the street. Left every memory at my feet. You thought my silence meant